Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Psych290 Research Methods in Psychology. It's a beautiful spring day, lots of blue sky, lots of sunshine, nice warm temps, and so I hope you're all able to at least walk outside, maintain social distance, of course, and get out a little bit. Hope everything's all well with you guys. So we're taking a little walk in the woods, and as I do that, I shall talk about our next topic in Chapter 6 on methodological control and experiments. So the other thing that can affect your study in terms of the validity is what's known as experimenter bias and participant bias. Essentially, experiment is a type of social interaction. You have an experimenter and you have the participant in the room together. And so you have different biases that the experimenter and the participant could possibly have. Okay, so experimenter bias first. Essentially, what that means is that the experimenter could have a particular bias that could change the behavior of the participant in some subtle or maybe not so subtle way. Okay, so essentially, we have an example of this, at least from a demonstration standpoint, when we talked about the clever Hans demonstration early on in chapters 1 and 2. Essentially, the handler of Hans gave off subtle cues as to how the horse should behave. Okay, so that's this idea of experimenter bias, that the experimenter, or in this particular case the handler, actually changed the behavior of the participant, in this case the horse, in some subtle way. All right. And another example of this, we talked also about preferential looking techniques a little while ago. Okay, that is, an infant is seated in basically the experimenter's lap, and then you show the stimuli to the infant. Okay, if the experimenter is not careful, they can subtly change the positioning of the baby, which could affect which stimulus that the baby does look at. So you have to be very, very careful. Again, this doesn't have to be some sort of nefarious thing. It's not like the experimenter is doing this on purpose, although obviously some could, but most likely it's more unconscious in a number of different ways. Okay, and anytime you treat a participant differentially, it can affect the validity of your experiment. Probably the most extreme example that you probably are familiar with is if you've ever seen the original Ghostbusters movie, the first scene with Bill Murray as the quote-unquote experimenter, and he does treat the male and the female subjects just a little bit differently. All right, so again, that scene used a lot in terms of the ethics involved in experimentation, but also gets at this idea of if you treat the female subject differently than the male, then you are going to introduce another type of confound to your experiment. So what you want to do is make sure everybody is treated the same way. One way of dealing with that is to use what's known as protocols or scripts. You read the instructions to every participant the same exact way, with the exception of if you are using that script to change the level of the independent variable. Okay, but everyone should be treated the same exact way. All right. So what's the best way of dealing with experimenter bias? A term that I'm sure you probably are familiar with, what's known as a double-blind study. A double-blind study simply means that the first blind essentially is that the participant doesn't know the true nature or the true hypothesis of the study, and the second double part of the blind thing is that the experimenter that is interacting with the participant doesn't know the hypothesis. So if they don't know the hypothesis, then they aren't going to subtly try to influence the participant to behave in a way that's consistent with the hypothesis. All right, so I think that's pretty clear. All right, so the second thing is participant bias. Participant bias is that the participants could be biased just by being in the experiment. Okay, so I know the book goes into a nice, long, historical explanation of the Hawthorne effect. That's very nice if you're into the history of psychology, but basically all I really need you to know is that the Hawthorne effect is that people, just by being in an experiment, can change their behavior. Okay, they may want to behave in a way that's going to be make the experimenter happy. Okay, so essentially this Hawthorne effect Again, the basic idea is that just being an experiment can bias the participant to behave in a way that isn't terribly natural for them, that they're trying to help the experimenter out and just perform better just by being by the nature of being in the experiment. Right. The other thing in terms of participant bias, we talked about this, or at least I gave you the PowerPoint for this in an earlier chapter and said, well, we get to it in this chapter. There's different type of subjects. Some subjects are labeled the good subject. They're really trying to help you out. They're maybe over enthusiastic. They're trying to figure out what the hypothesis is. We also have what's known as apprehensive participants who really aren't sure. Maybe they've seen Ghostbusters one or too many times and they're afraid they're going to be shocked or something bad might happen to them. So you really want to allay any fears that they have that nothing bad's going to happen to them. Okay, that's the apprehensive subject. And then you have the maybe even hostile, or the ones that are trying to screw up your experiment just because maybe they were in some way coerced or felt like they were forced to be in the experiment. Okay, so the best way of dealing with that is making sure that, like we talked about in chapter 2, it's not ethical to force somebody to be into your experiment. So you want to give a person options rather than, if it's for extra credit, for example, you want to give them options to be get extra credit in another different way, not just being a participant. Okay, so those are the 3 different types of participants that you could experience. So you really want to make sure that you try not to have them go one way or the other. Okay, so the other major idea that's associated with this is the idea of demand characteristics. Demand characteristics are, again, when the participant tries to figure out what the hypothesis is, and then they try to behave in a way that they think that the hypothesis is. Okay. Problem with that is they certainly can be wrong. I mean, they can be terribly wrong, and then they're not acting naturally, and that way again, that's going to affect the validity of your experiment if they're trying to figure out the hypothesis and they're wrong. Or even if they do figure out what the hypothesis is and behave consistently, that's not terribly natural. That's going to affect the validity of your experiment as well. Okay, so again, basic thing here is that again, if you use strict protocols, you treat everybody the same way. Hopefully, they won't pick up on any sort of demand characteristic that the experimenter is basically giving them, okay, or at least giving off to them. So 2 ways of dealing with this is deception. Okay, if you have a study where you're afraid they are going to figure out what the hypothesis is, then you may not tell them the true nature of the experiment. You use what's known as the cover story, and therefore they're not going to figure out what the true nature of the experiment is. The problem with that is that there is some ethical issues there. Okay, but as long as you debrief the subjects afterwards and you tell them what the true nature of the experiment was, that's really pretty much the way that you deal with that situation. Okay, and the last one is manipulation checks. You want to do manipulation checks to ensure that nobody is figuring out the hypothesis. Okay, all right, so that finally puts an end on chapter 6. Have a great day, guys, and we'll talk to you later. Take care. Bye.